Evan Pedrick, the subject of this biography, at the time a radicalised 22-year-old initiate of a Hindu-based religious cult called Ananda Marga, placed a bomb in a bin outside the Hilton, intending to assassinate the then Prime Minister of India, Morarji Desai, who was staying at the hotel. Now, how do we know this? How can we be so certain of this? Because of my forensic research over many years into the Hilton bombing? No, not for that reason at all. Rather, we know all of that because Evan Pedrick came forward in 1989 and confessed to the Hilton bombing, came forward of his own volition. He gave the police and later the courts a highly detailed account of how he'd become convinced that the assassination of Morarji Desai, although regrettable, was nevertheless necessary to secure the release from prison of Ananda Marga's founder and guru, P.R. Sarkar, from jail in India, where he was serving a long sentence for murder. Pedrick then gave police and subsequently the courts a highly detailed account of all of the plotting that went up to the Hilton bombing and of his attempted execution of it. Really, the prepositions tell you the story. Evan Pedrick confessed to the Hilton bombing, was charged with the Hilton bombing, was convicted of the Hilton bombing, and went to jail for the Hilton bombing. And you know, the English language has a handy phrase to cover these kinds of circumstances. Case closed. 42 years on from the Hilton bombing, 23 years after being released from prison, Pedrick is an Anglican priest in Perth, and he continues, this is important, to take full responsibility for the attack on the Hilton. He's avoided the media entirely, but on the occasion of the 40th anniversary of the bombing, 2 years ago, he authorised the Anglican Diocesan Office in Perth to respond to any inquiries with the following statement. Quote, "At this time I have no comment to make other than to say how deeply sorry I am for my actions in 1978 as a member of Ananda Marga, and that I stand by the truthfulness of the evidence I gave in 1989. Well, so the mystery of the Hilton bombing, to paraphrase Philip Adams on the cover of my book, the mystery is how anybody ever got away with calling it a mystery in the first place. The conspiracy theories that have come along over the years to take Ananda Marga out of the picture and place Australian state and federal authorities and agencies such as ASIO and the New South Wales Special Branch Police in the frame for the bombing, they're not the central focus of my book. It's an authorised biography of Pedrick, but they are certainly addressed in the book and dismissed. They received a very similar treatment 4 years ago in a book by Rachel Landers called Who Bombed the Hilton? The answer to Philip Adams's question, how can this be called a mystery, is, I think, a mixture of naivety and of cynicism. In other words, some people promote these ridiculous theories actually believing they're true. Others are simply seeking to deflect attention away from the Ananda Marga and quite possibly from themselves. The Hilton bombing happened at 12:42 in the morning on Monday, the 13th of February 1978. For what it's worth, I was a young cadet journalist at the Age newspaper in Melbourne at the time, and in a very tiny way had some part in the newspaper's coverage of this enormous news story. To some extent, it stuck in my mind as a result of that, and in all the ensuing years, I was never properly able to let it go. As I say, it happened between midnight and 1 a.m. on the 13th of February 1978 as a team of garbage collectors from the city of Sydney emptied a bin from the front of the Hilton into their truck. A massive bomb that was inside the bin, made of gelignite, exploded as it struck the hard inside surface of their compactor. 2 council workers, Alec Carter and Bill Favell, were literally blown to pieces. Paul Burmistrew, a young police constable who was guarding the hotel, was grievously injured and died 9 days later. 9 other people were injured in the bombing. We need to be cautious about using cultural cliches. Nevertheless, I think there's some truth in saying that the bombing changed Australia forever. To some extent, it even was the day that Australia grew up. Certainly the day that Australia was dragged into the age of terrorism. Just to give you an indication of how naive we were about terrorism in 1978, the police had not even bothered to check the rubbish bins outside the hotel, where Desai, the Indian PM, and a dozen other regional leaders were staying for the inaugural Commonwealth Heads of Government, inaugural Commonwealth Heads of Regional Government meeting, or CHOGRM. This fact of the bins not being checked has of course contributed to the theories of official involvement in the Hilton bombing. But the head of security for CHOGRM, Superintendent Reg Douglas, took full responsibility for this oversight just a day after the bombing. "I did not think it necessary," he said, "especially as squads of police were stationed near the bin all day." Australia in 1978. Within 24 hours, the Fraser government had called out the army to protect the CHOGRM leaders as they made their way from Sydney to Bowral for a retreat. And that was the first time during peacetime that soldiers with rifles had ever patrolled Australian streets. We see in recent days discussion about whether we might be about to see this occur again. Instead of travelling to Bowral by train as planned, the leaders were ferried down by helicopter. Nevertheless, the journalists covering CHOGRM were not told of that switch. They were taken to Central Station by bus as if they were going to board the train, and a charade took place where a red carpet was rolled out. Food and drink for the bigwigs was carried up onto the train. And for added plausibility, soldiers with guns were stationed along the railway track and the overpasses out of Sydney. It was a ruse, and all of this folderol evoked a rather dry comment from the Sydney Morning Herald. Quote, "Operation Ghost Train was carried out with a sophistication that contrasted sharply with the position on Sunday when a bomber was able to plant an explosive in a street rubbish bin under the eyes of police guarding the conference venue," unquote. So wrote the editorialist. As a result of the Hilton bombing, the government commissioned a report from the head of Scotland Yard, Sir Robert Mark, which led to the establishment of the Australian Federal Police in 1979, another result of the Hilton bombing. 2 years later, in 1981, I returned to Australia from a 3-year stint overseas, and I was astounded at the CCTV cameras on virtually every street corner in Melbourne. They were there to guard the foreign leaders who'd recently visited Melbourne for a Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting, CHOGM. The leaders had gone, but the cameras stayed. This too was a legacy of the Hilton. And there was a further immediate reaction from the authorities to the bombing. They focused all of their attention on the Ananda Marga religious cult, focused their attention on establishing a case that it had been responsible, unsuccessfully at that time. But this single-minded focus on Ananda Marga has also provided fodder for the conspiracists. Endless suggestions have been made that the cops were intent on a frame-up of Ananda Marga. Why were the police so focused on an innocuous religious sect? Why were they ignoring other leads? Well, let me suggest that for the police not to have focused on Ananda Marga would have been far more negligent even than their failure to check those rubbish bins. Ananda Marga, you see, had been perpetrating violent attacks on Indian official targets for the 6 or 7 years leading up to the Hilton bombing. This is all on the public record. There were incidents in the UK, Denmark, the US and elsewhere, and they included bomb attacks. Several Margis, as they called themselves, had burned themselves to death in protest at their guru Sarkar's imprisonment. One of them indeed was a young Australian woman, Lynette Phillips, who set fire to herself on the doorstep of the United Nations headquarters in Geneva, just 4 months prior to the Hilton bombing. At the beginning of 1977, the British Home Secretary had denied entry to Britain to 2 Margis who were seeking asylum there. There is a violent wing to this organisation, he said. I do not believe that this country should be a haven for people who've engaged in violence of this nature, unquote. And now here is what those who want you to believe that Ananda Marga was framed really would prefer that we skip over. There were a number of serious incidents right here in Australia in the second half of 1977. In August, there was an assault on the Sydney offices of Air India in which animal blood was splattered over terrified employees. The following month, the military attaché at the Indian Embassy in Canberra, Colonel Iqbal Singh, was stabbed in the chest as he slept in bed next to his wife. He and his wife were kidnapped, though they managed to escape. This was front page news in the Sydney Morning Herald at the time. Just as the Air India incident I mentioned was also prominently reported in the newspapers. The police charged members of Ananda Marga with both of these attacks, and Colonel Singh's attacker was sent to jail for 3 years. Now, until 1971, Ananda Marga had been a harmless Hindu sect practicing yoga and meditation. How it suddenly became quite a violent group, culminating in the Hilton attack, is a phenomenon that's quite well understood by students of so-called new religious movements. It's been established that with such a group, any attempt to restrict the freedom of the guru can cause sudden radicalisation and a turn to violence. And this is exactly what occurred when Sarkar was arrested for murdering a number of his own previous senior monks. Once Sarkar was released from jail, only months after the Hilton bombing, Ananda Marga reverted to its earlier harmless incarnation, which it retains to this day, even though the group is somewhat prestigial. Sarkar died in 1990, and even now, Ananda Marga runs a couple of primary schools in New South Wales and Queensland. The events that followed Sarkar's arrest are why, at the end of 1977, the Australian government banned the entry of Ananda Marga Acharyas, monks, who were not Australian citizens, into Australia. It's also why the Ananda Marga biannual retreat that was held at Galston in outer northwest Sydney, just 3 weeks before the bombing, was under close surveillance by New South Wales police and security agencies. And this is the retreat where Evan Pedrick later told the New South Wales Supreme Court that he'd been conscripted to plant the bomb outside the Hilton. I've described the Nanda Marga as a fairly standard sub-Hindu sect, of which there are many, many, but it certainly had a few special features. Firstly, Sarkar's status within a Nanda Marga was quite special and verged on the godlike. Margis believed that Sarkar possessed a range of special powers, including being able to speak every language in the world and also being able to intervene directly in incidents and events far, far away from where he was. They called Sarkar Sri Sri Anandamurti, embodiment of bliss. Ananda Marga means path of bliss. The second unusual feature of Ananda Marga is that it had an elaborate theory of social revolution, according to which the day was fast approaching when Sarkar and his disciples would stand at the head of a single world government. Because this so-called progressive utilisation theory, or PROUT, contains some mumbo-jumbo about redistribution of wealth and each according to his need, Ananda Marga was able to forge alliances with left-wing groups on Australian university campuses in the 1970s. These alliances were to come in handy when Ananda Marga became the focus of intense police interest following the Hilton bombing, and again a few months later when 3 members of the group were charged and convicted, though subsequently pardoned, of plotting to murder an Australian neo-Nazi leader called Robert Cameron. This was the so-called Yagoona conspiracy, based on the suburb where the 3 Margis mistakenly believed Cameron was living and where they were headed when they were arrested. The trials of these 3 Margis were accompanied by a noisy protest movement, and that noise was amplified a few years later in 1989 and 1990 when one of them, a man called Tim Anderson, was charged with plotting the Hilton attack along with Pedrick. Anderson was convicted in 1990 but then acquitted on appeal the following year. Leaving aside the rights or wrongs of the legal processes, and I say in my book that I believe the acquittal of Anderson was justified due to the failures of the Director of Public Prosecutions in the conduct of his trial, leaving aside all of that, the mindset of the protest movements that grew up around the Hilton trials were an example of reverse engineering or post hoc reasoning. If Ananda Marga was an ally of the left, so it went, then almost by definition its members could not have plotted murder either on George Street or at Yagoona. The only point I'd make about this is the left-wing associations of Ananda Marga were quite illusory, both internally in terms of the strict lines of authority it maintained and the strict control that it maintained over its members, and externally in this ridiculous notion it had of achieving world domination. Ananda Marga was perhaps closer to a fascist organisation than to any socialist model. This then was the organisation of which Evan Pedrick, then a naive and idealistic 21-year-old, became an acolyte in Hobart in December of 1976. Evan had grown up in Western Australia, the son of a minister in the Methodist Church. His childhood was entirely normal, and he'd been a gifted student of mathematics at the University of Western Australia, who, like many of the young people of that period, including me, became gradually disillusioned with the values of his parents and the broader society which those values appeared to represent. Also, like many young people of the time, including me, his response to this sense of disillusion was rather vague and unfocused, until that moment when, unlike me, he stumbled into the maw of a cult that just at that moment happened to be turning violent. If you read the book you'll find a detailed description of Evan's initiation into Anandamaga. To progress to a full-time position as an organiser with the group, just 6 months after first encountering it in Hobart, Evan attended a 12-week training program at Lewisham, here in Sydney. During this program, the young people involved, about a dozen of them as I say, were forbidden to leave the house without permission. They were subjected to physical and mental duress. Every moment of their lives was subject to control and surveillance. As I explain in the book, this aligns very closely with well-established brainwashing techniques. Those techniques stress the need to isolate the target from their customary contacts and associations. They involve moving the subject very, very gradually along the steps towards a new understanding so that they won't realise how far they've moved from the understandings that they used to have. Rigid control is necessary in order to create a sense of powerlessness in the subject. All of this was applied to Evan in Lewisham. He emerged from this as a fully committed Margie. And in 1989, he explained to the Supreme Court how he went straight from this retreat at Galston in January of '78 to a flea pit near Central Station. Disguised as a vagrant in a tatty brown suit, he spent his days casing out the Hilton, gathering and assembling the elements of his bomb and seeking to establish the details of Desaix's arrival in Sydney on Sunday the 12th of February. He told the police and the courts of how he attempted to detonate his bomb using a remote control device, as he saw or thought he saw Desaix arriving at the hotel that Sunday afternoon. When nothing happened, when he pressed the button, he concluded with an enormous sense of relief that Sarkar had intervened from his jail cell in India and prevented this unnecessary carnage. He set off to hitchhike back to Brisbane, where he was a full-time organiser with Anandamaga. About 7 hours later, the team from City of Sydney arrived to empty the bins. In the years that I've been researching Evan's story, one fact has stood out for me perhaps more vividly than any other. If he'd achieved what he set out to do that Sunday afternoon on George Street, at least 100 people, including him, would have died. This would have been the most serious terrorist attack of the 1970s. Just briefly, a few reflections to close. Things I've been thinking about long after my book has gone to press, but not really resolved in my own mind. Firstly, just as I was struck by the innocence of Australia before the Hilton bombing, I was also struck by the kind of epochal divide that the rise of the internet marks in our cultural history. If the internet had been around in 1976, 77 and 78, I don't think the Hilton bombing could have happened. Evan, as he came through this initiation into Anandamaga, he knew very little about Sarkar's imprisonment and the reasons for it, and he knew virtually nothing about the violent acts that were being perpetrated around the world by the group he was in. This sort of information silo is another prominent feature of the way brainwashing works. Today, of course, he would have known exactly what was going on in real time, courtesy of the internet. Moreover, his loving family, instead of just sitting there in Perth wondering what kind of organisation has Evan got himself caught up in, would have been Googling up all that information on the internet, and I'm sure would have staged an intervention. Second reflection, back to the conspiracy theories. I've been struck how in the responses to this book by reviewers and interviewers, no one has really challenged the truth of Evan's story or of my telling of it. And really, why would you? Evan is a respected and fully rehabilitated member of his community. why on earth would he continue now to take full responsibility for a murderous act he had nothing to do with? Gerard Henderson pointed out in the newspaper 25 years ago that if official agencies really did plot and execute the Hilton bombing, there must have been many plotters involved in this scheme. And he wondered, how on earth could it have been kept so quiet? Nobody felt any remorse? Nobody had one too many down the pub and blurted it all out? This is even truer now than when Gerard Henderson observed it. To state the matter bluntly, more than 40 years after the Hilton bombing, not a single shred of positive evidence has emerged to support any of the conspiracy theories. Can lay all that nonsense to rest, maybe not now, but eventually, I'll be well satisfied. The Hilton bombing was the most significant public event in Australia in the 1970s, apart from the constitutional crisis of 75. The community has a right to understand what happened. More important even is that these conspiracy theories mock the dead, the survivors and their families. They have suffered enough. Finally, I would say that in some sense, the years I've spent thinking about and researching the Hilton bombing have really challenged my perspective on human nature. For 3 of his 64 years, as a result of a systematic thought reform process, Evan Pedrick was an entirely unrecognisable human being. He was a good and gentle person until he fell into the clutches of a cult, and he became a good and gentle person again. The depths of his remorse and contrition, his attempt at reparation and rehabilitation, are, to my mind, the core of this book. I don't mind saying that I'm honoured to call him my friend. Nevertheless, this story presents us with a puzzle about human nature and how we operate that I can't say I've successfully resolved. And I look forward to discussing these things with Gerard now.